Hi folks, it's September 6th, and this is your professor, Stan Wanglund, for Psychology 223. And I wanted to make an up-to-date video for you. The ones on your modules are done or pre-done, and these are live up to the moment. So we should be on module number 2, which has to do with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and a lot of the related stuff to the Americans with Disability Act. And Chapter 2 really has a lot of good information in terms of fundamental information from you, in terms of the laws and the legislative work that's been done to make sure that people who are differently abled or disabled, receive services as a right rather than a privilege. And that's very important because early in my career, I've been in the field since 1972, believe it or not. And early in my career, working with people who were disabled or mentally ill or having any kind of developmental disability, certainly any kind of treatments that they received were, not necessarily by a right. It was more or less dependent upon the resources of the community and was viewed as a privilege. So as I indicated in the email that I sent you today, what are some issues for critical thinking that we want in Chapter 2? Some real issues from the field, since I'm an adjunct professor for many decades, but my real work is in the field of developmental disabilities, running large-scale programs, working in institutions, so on and so forth. So one of the first ones that I put down there for you is the FAPE, or Freedom and Appropriate Public Education, that when it's determined that somebody does have a disabling condition, we say that we should have free and appropriate public education, that's a right. But what are the critical thinking issues with that? What are the things that really come up? Number one is how much money, and where does the money come from? School districts apply for federal monies, they have state monies, so on and so forth. But depending upon the needs of the children in the school programs, the budgets can be dramatically different depending upon the populations in those areas, and also the nature of the conditions. Okay, in some areas they may be not as severe as in others. So the other term is when you're making decisions about granting money for folks, what does the term appropriate mean? I know in my career, early on, as I took administrative positions in treatment facilities, that was always a big bugaboo. In terms of funding, in terms of compliance, the term appropriate. Appropriate to you may be something totally different for me. So now we have to use standardized testing, we have to have goals that are measurable, observable, have very defined outcomes for the person. And in the 21st century, the person themselves, not the treatment team, and rightly so, and their family, determines what their goals are. Okay? So that's a big one. Another one is when we're giving free and appropriate education, we want to make sure that the monies and the services have an educational benefit to the person. Once again, what the heck does that mean? An educational benefit. That's a very vague term. Okay? So these are things, as critical thinkers, we want to think about, and if we were in a live class, we'd be having a big discussion about that. So I'm throwing that out to you. Think about it. What is an educational benefit? What you think is an educational benefit may not be what I think is an educational benefit. When I sent you some short videos of a little girl with Down syndrome, for example, and it's wonderful early on with that condition where many parents get fooled into thinking their kid with hard work and inclusion is really going to catch up to the other kids. But that's not so. It's Down syndrome. Okay? That's a genetic disorder. And it really affects intellectual development, and it affects other forms of development, adaptive behaviors, sensory motor development. It affects your health in terms of your heart, early onset Alzheimer's as you get older. You can have all kinds of congenital problems. Now, is inclusion or programs great for people with Down syndromes? Absolutely, but they will peak out in many areas, and you do have to explain that to parents. So an educational benefit for me would be the actual educational goals, number one, but they would also be the social goals, the peer goals, the goals of self-esteem, interacting with other people, activities of daily living, functional skills. I would be concentrating on. I work with more families where a child who has Down syndrome, for example, or another particular disability can't do math or some other thing, and somebody has the idea that they can teach them through constant repetition or another manner or whatever it is, and their central nervous system just can't perform that function. And you have to sit down with a family member and say, hey, this is something they're not going to get, and that's okay. They're just not going to get that. There's no magical, cure that we have. There's no magical procedure that we have right now. But there's a million other things that person can do. Okay? So those are issues that you want to think about. Eligibility for services, for special education, for the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, for Social Security, all kinds of different ages for funding. When you're going for eligibility, there's usually a very set criteria, and the criteria is dependent upon standardized evaluations. And the big question there is, are the evaluation tools that are being used, are they relevant, are they valid, are they reliable, who's doing the testing, is there any bias with the testing, are the testing procedures being done in a manner that's really conducive to getting good empirical data on the person. Now, I was the eligibility coordinator for this region, which is larger than the state of Connecticut, for over a decade, and I was in charge of other psychologists and headed that particular thing up, amongst other programs. And my goodness, I saw thousands of evaluations, many years prior to that as well, on children, and a huge number of them weren't worth the paper that they were written on, in my opinion. They weren't reliable, they weren't valid. Sometimes the test instruments were dated, or they were questionable in terms of how they were done. The biases, the very common ones, were well-meaning family members or teachers or other people would give elevated scores or depressed scores, or children, people going in for evaluations for a one-shot deal to an evaluative service where there's a 3-hour block of evaluation, and the person hadn't eaten, or the family got lost going there, or the person, quite frankly, was pissed off and didn't want to be there. That's a clinical term, being pissed off. They didn't want to be there. So the person wasn't conducive for the testing, so the results were invalid. However, those are the results that came down in the report, and people were making decisions on it. So that's really what happens in the field. How accurate are they? Okay. How accurate are the evaluative tools? Okay. When you're not fully eligible, or you don't show a full-blown developmental disability, but it's bordering on that, we have 504 plans in special education, and we say that, yeah, there's something going on there, but it's not at the level of service that you need a full-blown IEP and all the other, the funding for that. So there's a different level of funding, and that level of funding will be for reasonable accommodations for the person. Some of you may have that, where you may have some version of attention deficit disorder or some such thing, and you need extra time, or you have dyslexia, or you have something else, and everything else is great except that particular situation. So reasonable accommodations are given to you. That's another area as critical thinkers. What does reasonable mean? To families and the person who has that particular condition, it might be quite different to people doling out the cash, or a treatment team that, quite frankly, has become insensitive to your particular needs. Okay? So something to think about. Another one is, what is the least restrictive environment? What does that really mean? Your textbook says pretty much that it's educating people to the maximum extent with peers who are not as disabled as you are, or not disabled at all, and putting you in that environment to the extent possible. That sounds great, and it's a wonderful thing, but your textbook and the films that we show don't show all the various conditions that people have. How differently able they are. In some cases, there are people who are violent who have differently abled conditions. People have very serious mental health issues. People have very profound autistic behaviors or other behaviors where they're not only oppositional and defiant, but they're downright dangerous, or their central nervous system isn't functioning well, or they have sensory problems. And the big question is can they really be mixed in in a non-disabled population? Some people say absolutely, and I sent you a little video on that with the bowling pins and whatever. Other people say no, it's a disservice to the person when somebody's having a psychotic episode to be in with people who are, you know, perfectly normal at that point in time and really don't know what the heck is going on. So, you know, inclusion and least restricted environments are very questionable things, and they don't go exactly as one would think. People many times are not put in the least restrictive environment because they can't handle it. And inclusion is a wonderful thing, but there are some people who have different abilities or disabled, and they don't feel that they are benefiting from inclusion. They don't feel comfortable with full inclusion. Those kinds of things. The last question I'd like you to think about is when we are having a least restrictive environment, or we are putting people in programs with inclusion, or we are setting educational or treatment goals, should those goals and should those procedures that we're involved in with the person, should they be developmentally appropriate, or should a person be with developmentally with a set of folks, or should they be with their peers, the chronological or age? And that's a really important question, because you could have a 13-year-old person really be at the developmental level of a 4-year-old. And are they really benefiting from being with a bunch of 13-year-olds or 14-year-olds who were in their teenage years and, you know, have a whole bunch of other conditions that they're dealing with? Some people say absolutely that they're going to role model those behaviors, they're going to benefit from that, and I've seen that. And other times you would say, my goodness gracious, no, this person may be 13 years old and he or she doesn't really benefit from being in with 13 or 14-year-olds. And it would be better not being with 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds, but maybe somebody of a lower age, of a lower developmental age, or somebody of a much higher one who would be more patient with them. And that's why you have an individualized education plan. And that's why the family and the person themselves should have a lot to say in that matter. Well, this is kind of an informal tape. If you were a student of mine or an intern, which I've had many of, this is the kind of talk I'd be giving to you about these kind of things and answering some of your questions. So I hope you find it helpful. I just throw them up on YouTube and then we'll send you them in a mashup. And if you don't find them helpful, then just delete them. Okay? Well, you have a nice night. Everybody's doing really great from what I see. And if you have any questions, you can see I'm pretty accessible. Just email or call me. Okay, I'm going to turn off my iPhone now.